Welcome back. Good afternoon, morning or evening depending on where you are. So today is going to be a slightly special day because I'm going to be reviewing one of the cameras that I've been using as a daily driver for quite some time, which is this camera, the A7R3. Today we're not just reviewing this camera, we're going to be discussing about how it's like to actually use this camera in a work setting because I've been using it for my career for the past almost 2 years now. So I've been using this camera for my work for almost 2 years now. So I'm going to be sharing my experiences on how it's performed in a professional sense, as well as if it's still as good as the day that I got it, or if the cracks have started to show. In this video, I'm going to be giving my honest opinion on a long-term review of the A7R3. I'm going to recommend this to people who meet certain criteria, and I'm going to give some of the deal breakers that I feel like if you really want this camera, but these don't tick your boxes, then you should not get it. Alright, so to answer the question of this whole video very briefly, answer would be yes. I find that this camera still is very worth it in 2023 and into 2024 as well. So this camera has really stood the test of time, I feel. The day that I got it compared to now, I still feel that this is a really capable camera, and I would still prefer it over the other market competitors. Okay, so I'm going to go in depth on why I feel that this camera is still a bargain if you can get it for an affordable price. But first, I'm going to need to share where I came from using this camera, as well as why I chose this camera in the first place. So for me, I upgraded from an APS-C line, and I do photography as a full-time career at this point. So in order to do that, I needed something that was a bit more capable. At 42.4 megapixels, this camera delivers amazing image quality. So what this translates to is to being able to crop into images and then still maintaining a decent image. So for me, I believe that you should always frame everything properly in camera itself when you're taking the photo. But for the times that you can't, this really proves to be a lifesaver, especially when you cannot frame the shot in time or there's something happening really in quick succession during an event. So this will allow you to be able to shoot a bit wider, but being able to crop in and get your composition in post. Then moving on to a more casual sense, rather than professional, this allows you to crop in or use an APS-C mode where it basically converts I think 35mm lens to a 50 or something along that range. So what that allows me to do is when I'm going out and I don't really want to take a bunch of lenses with me or maintain a certain professional quality to my images, I can just bring a wider lens like a 35 to go around on the street shooting, and then I can punch in, and that allows me to get a 50 as well. So it really gives that sense of versatility. So I use this when I don't really want to carry around a bunch of gear. I just bring out one lens, and that allows me to be able to punch in when I really need to. And although that doesn't deliver the best image quality, for times that I really need to just crop in and shoot and know what it's going to look like in post, that really does the job for me. Okay, so however, one of its downsides is that the files on this camera is absolutely huge. Okay, so based on my experience with all of this, the raw files tend to be around 43-ish MB per photo, which I feel like for a raw photo, it can really fill up a card really fast if you're only shooting RAW or if you're shooting RAW and JPEG. But I feel that that is a really good trade-off for being able to get files that are quite versatile that you can crop and manipulate in post if needed. Moving on, I'm going to make 3 points which I feel like this camera really stands up to in terms of performance till this day. So one of them is autofocus, one of them is the long battery life, and then the other one is the weather sealing. So let's begin with its autofocus. So in my experience, I haven't done any scientific testing on this, but based on my own use and in my professional use of this camera, I find that it tends to lock onto focus pretty quickly. So I found no issues in hitting my targets as long as I'm able to control the focus point with the joystick at the back. So the focus works smoothly most of the time, and then from my experience during events, when shooting events, it tends to lock onto people's faces as well if I set it to the specific points of this frame, and it works pretty smoothly. I have no complaints about the autofocus and the speed of the autofocus as well. Even though like newer cameras might have better autofocus, or in fact do have better autofocus, I feel like for most people in most professional settings, as long as you're controlling the camera well enough, there should be no issue issue in capturing the focus that you need on the specific points that you need, proven that you set it up properly. The second point that I feel like really stands up till this day is the battery life. So the batteries for all of this, I feel that they really last quite a long time, and I have no worries in terms of if my battery is gonna die on me during shooting. So when I've done event shoots or concerts on this camera, I feel that I need to bring 2 batteries to be safe, because one battery can last me throughout half of the shoot, which usually would consist of most likely 3 to 4 hours. And then I also feel that if I brought along maybe 2 to 3 batteries, those would last me throughout most events most of the time. And my third point for this lens that stands out really till today is the weather sealing. I have brought this camera out to a light drizzle situation, and I didn't really have much problems with it. I just don't really want to risk it, because I'm scared that if I'm going to bring it out during a heavy drizzle, that it might, or like a thunderstorm or something like that, it might not stand up. Because my door over here is non-existent, I bought this camera second-hand, so the previous owner did not really take the best care of it, so I wouldn't really bring it in a rainy situation. However, for a normal camera like that doesn't have a non-existent battery door, I feel like it could actually be fine in a heavy to medium kind of rain. And if I put like a really nice weather sealed lens on it, I would say that I will be pretty confident in bringing it out during most situations. Now, the climate that I live in doesn't really allow me to have snow or whatever, so there's only rain here. But I would say and assume that in really hot places or in really cold places, this camera would perform pretty well. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the actual build of the camera, as well as some of the physical aspects of it. So the aspects that I want to talk about are its handling, its IBIS, in-body image stabilization, as well as its aesthetics overall of it. Okay, so let's begin with its handling. So I feel that the handling for this camera, in my own personal opinion, I usually prefer cameras that are more tactile and that feel better for personal shooting, so that I can really feel the camera and feel that I'm taking part in taking the image. But in terms of work and in a professional sense, I prefer these kind of camera bodies. And what do I mean by this is that, so on the back of the camera over here, if I want to change the shutter speed, I can change it simply like this. If I want to change the ISO, I can change it like this. And if I want to change the aperture, it gets changed like this. So everything I would say is quite easy to access, especially if you have this on one hand. And if you have a strap on it and you don't mind changing the buttons like this while holding it like that, I would say that it's pretty easy to change settings on the fly as you go and shoot in a professional setting. One way I would describe this camera is that I would say that changing everything is quite fluid. I have, I would say, medium-sized hands, and the actual handling of the camera when I'm holding it is pretty alright without the cage. I would say the grip is quite sizable, but I choose to use this camera with a cage. So I have a cage from SmallRig, and I feel that with a cage, it just gives you a lot of more options. One of the reasons I say that is because when you're not really shooting and holding the camera like this, and if you don't want to strain your arms, on a long-term shoot, you can either hold the camera like this or like this, and the grip is pretty, I would say, deep in, or like deep enough so that I have confidence in holding my camera like that. So you pair this up with a strap, and most of the time you can just hold the camera like this, and it doesn't really add much strain onto your hands when you're actually shooting. So for shoots that last like really long hours, I would feel that this would be a really good option to be able to relieve some of the stress. And it's made the handling of this camera really easy to be able to hold for a few hours in a row. So the back of this camera is packed with dials and buttons. So in the case where you want to change your settings, I'm talking about in a professional sense, these buttons, the custom buttons on top here, can be mapped to certain actions which really help you to change either the autofocus settings or the focus areas or focus zones, white balance and stuff like that. And all of these can be customized in the menus themselves. Speaking of menus, I know that Sony has its dreaded menu system that people don't really like, but in my opinion, once you set it up for the first time, you go through everything and you spend some time to really set your camera up, then you add anything that you need to really change on the spot in the quick menu settings. After you do that, it tends to not really be needed to be accessed, in a sense where you don't really need to go into the menu to set anything up. You really have everything either mapped to your custom buttons here, or you can access it in the quick menu, which is pretty easy to access. Moving on to the stabilization of the A7R III. I feel that the stabilization is quite reliable and it allows for handheld shooting in most cases to be totally okay. In terms of photos, that is. In videos, most of the time I found it to be quite okay. It's not going to be as smooth as a gimbal. However, if you do steady your hands, then it's not really that much of an issue. So on the photography side, it allows you to use a slower shutter speed. So if you're shooting in a darker place, then you don't really need to worry about having your shutter speed set too slow. Sometimes you can tend to lower down your shutter speed and then the IBIS will correct for your hand shaking, and that will allow for a cleaner shot if you're doing more low light stuff. In terms of video, I feel that the IBIS helps to relieve micro jitters or small stutters that you might have in your hand while shooting, and that has been proven to be really valuable in times where I don't have a gimbal with me or I really just need to get a quick shot. I can just point the camera and I can rely on the IBIS to correct any of those micro jitters that you might have. The aesthetics I feel are pretty standard for most Sony cameras. They kind of look the same and it's kind of nothing special, but it doesn't look bad either. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is I would think that a lot of people will say that it's a pretty good thing. However, I feel like for another certain small demographic of people, this might really be a deal breaker. The A7R3 offers the essential video modes, which I would say are 4K 30fps and 1080p at 120 fps. So with all the video specs out of the way, I feel that one of the deal breakers for me right now, if I were to purchase this camera again, is the bitrate, which is kept at 100 Mbps. So that might be a deal breaker for some people, as they might want a higher bitrate video in order to achieve better quality. So for all the videographers out there, I would say that this might not be the best option for you. And that's not to say that the videos here look bad, it's just that after using a camera with a higher bitrate and better video in general, I find that this is one of the things that has not held up the best till this day. One of the other big deal breakers that I found with this camera when shooting video was its max color depth, which in this case is 8-bit. Working with log footages such as S-Log3 was almost impossible for me with this camera. I tried shooting on S-Log2 as well, however that didn't really do it for me too. And then when I tried to shoot on HLG, I found that I might as well be shooting in the normal picture profile, which I found to have a much faster turnaround as well. So don't get me wrong, you can really get this camera to look good straight out of camera without any picture profiles. However, if you really are into video editing, cinematography, or just playing with video in general, then I wouldn't really recommend this camera, as there are other better options out there. One of the things that really might draw someone to this camera is that it might be a budget-friendly option. So I'm going to use the term budget-friendly in a really loose way. Budget-friendly can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for me, upgrading from an APS-C camera to a full-frame camera, I found this to be one of the more budget-friendly options based on everything else. So I'm saying this especially if you're comparing the A7R3 to the A7 IV, the A7 V, or even Canon's line of R cameras. I feel like the A7R3 hits a really nice spot where it punches way above its price tag, especially if you can get it second-hand. So I won't be covering the exact price of this camera, as time goes on, the camera price is going to go down, and then different countries might have different variations on the pricing of this camera. But I'm going to dive into why purchasing this camera might be a financially smart decision. So for me, I feel like a smart move would be to, instead of spending tons of money on a new camera body and not having a really good lens, I would suggest to purchase an A7R3 and get a better lens to accompany that camera. Because with all of these kind of cameras, you're really going to get a huge boost in image quality when it comes to the glass and not really the camera bodies necessarily. So who is this camera for? I feel that this camera is for people who are using APS-C or the APS-C line of cameras, maybe Micro Four Thirds or something like that, and they want to upgrade to a full frame or transition to full frame. So I feel that that would be a really nice sweet spot in terms of you're not spending too much money, but you're also getting a very capable camera when swapping over to full frame. So my second candidate on someone who should get this camera is someone who is a professional photographer, who is either from a Nikon system or a Canon system, and they want to swap over to Sony but they don't really want to burn a hole in their pocket. They could potentially get an A7R3 and upgrade their camera body down the line once they feel like they're comfortable in the system. conclusion, I feel that the A7R III is a valuable camera to have towards the end of 2023 and 2024 and maybe even moving forward. So I've been using this camera for quite some time and I find it to be quite reliable, and I don't think I'm going to be switching anytime soon as I mostly do photo. However, for all of the video people out there, I feel like there might be better options for you. In terms of the A7R III, it's not the latest camera and I don't think it's the most fancy camera. It doesn't have a lot of extra features to it like some other cameras might have. But I feel like if you're really looking for a dependable workhorse of a camera, I feel like this really might tick the boxes for you if you are a photographer. If you found any of this information useful, feel free to like and subscribe, and maybe even give some feedback if you have it in the comments.